Our next speaker is Charles Valheim, Director for Office of Urbanization of Graduate School of Design, former chair of landscape at Harvard. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. A round of applause, yeah? I mean, I couldn't imagine a better start. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. It's lovely to be here. This is a nice moment for me and for us and for our team. It's a beginning and also an end. I mean, we're starting this 10-day tour of the neighborhood. And it's really at the end of what's really been about a year's worth of planning, certainly 9 months. More so than anyone else, the events today and also over the coming week or two are the responsibility of not myself, but two people that are with us today. First of all, Marcela Ramos from the David Rockefeller Center, thank you so much for all your support. This is an extraordinary organization, and Marcela, you are among the most gifted organizers, entrepreneurs, leaders of this kind of work that I've had the pleasure to work with, so thank you so much for all your support. I also want to acknowledge my friend Felipe Vera. Of course, it was his idea as well. We had a tour about a year and a half ago, the GSD, on ecological urbanism. We went to Brazil, we went to Chile, and I was a part of that tour, and at the conclusion of that process, Marcela and Felipe proposed, well, might we do something more specific around the idea of landscape? Would that be of interest? Thanks. And we thought a little bit about that, and we thought, yeah, that might be timely. And so what I'll do in my brief remarks is just a couple of things. After that extraordinary introduction to the situation here in Colombia, I'm going to step back and talk a little bit about landscape as urbanism and what we mean by that. I'll also say a little bit about our tour and the venues we're going to and why, and what we hope to accomplish over the next couple of days. I also want to acknowledge, in addition to the Rockefeller Center, we put together an organizing team, Jeanette Sordi in Santiago, who couldn't be with us today. We also want to acknowledge our friends and partners here in Medellin, Camilo, Alejandro, and of course Luis Quejas, who's also a part of our faculty at the GSD, who have really been instrumental to thinking through the series. And then of course our partners in Brazil, Pedro Enrique de Cristo, Caroline Shannon de Cristo. Where are you guys? Thanks for being here. So over the course of the last 9 months, we've been responsible to, through the Office for Urbanization, put in place this series of events to ask a kind of basic question. Central to that work in the Office for Urbanization has been my associate Helen Kongsgaard, who's organized the work. And over the course of the next couple of minutes, I'll also say something a little bit about what this Office for Urbanization is meant to do as well. We, of course, also want to thank our partners here, our hosts, our venue. The Museum of Modern Art Medellin has been an extraordinary host for us. Thank you all for that. Of course, Urbam, EFIT, and all of their support, as well as our media partners, Plot, Arc Daily, among others. So we chose 3 cities around which to ask a kind of basic question. The question is really this: is it possible that over the course of the last decade or two, that something new, a new condition might be emerging in the Americas broadly that could be described under the term of landscape? Now, as you may know, landscape has enjoyed in the last 2 decades a kind of renaissance in the West, maybe a recovery intellectually, and in many parts of the world, in Western Europe, in North America, in Asia, much of the developing world, landscape as a form of urbanism has now been found relevant as an intellectual question, a set of discourses, and a set of practices. At the same moment, we, of course, understand the Americas more broadly, and certainly Latin America, South America, Colombia, among the examples, to be a situation where the tradition of the architect and the engineer are very dominant, and in which the dominant references have been European, maybe even Mediterranean, and in which landscape historically has not been really framed as a primary issue. Having said that, in the last couple of years, it's become clear to me and some of my colleagues that there is a generation of architects working in an alternative way. That these are architects educated here, but also abroad. Many of them are dealing with ecological subject matter. Many of them are dealing with biological or landscape subject matter. And so our work over the next 2 weeks is to try to answer that question: is there a value in trying to describe what's going on here. And so we're here really to learn. We're on a listening tour to try to understand and to organize as much information as we can about what's been going on in the context of Latin America in the last 2 decades. That got us to the selection of these 3 venues. For my part, it was important that we be in Colombia, given Colombia's history of architecture and urbanism in the last several years. And among the venues available, of course, Medellin appeals, given the work that's been done here in the last couple of decades. We're going next to Santiago, Chile, which is also a venue that has, among other things, it has a program in landscape architecture. It also has a nascent tradition that might be thought of as having to do with landscape. And then we're concluding next week in Brasilia, which has also a landscape program in its university. It also has maybe a kind of prehistory that's interesting to think about the city through landscape. So a few words about the work that we do. So the Office for Urbanization is a new research venue in the Graduate School of Design. Our mandate is to pursue urban projects through what we call sponsored design research. We work on a variety of sites and subjects, but we work with the idea that design is its own intellectual form, its own form of practice, and in which the university should be an active partner with government, NGOs, civil society, and with the professions. And so our epigraph here is by Herbert Simon, the Nobel laureate economist and political theorist, who argued that the natural sciences are concerned with describing the world as it is, whereas design is primarily concerned with the way the world ought to be. In that sense of ought to be, the idea of improving the world as we find it is central to our mission. The Office for Urbanization addresses societal and cultural conditions through sponsored design research projects on a range of topics. Our mission, what we do is we imagine alternative and better futures for a whole range of sites and subjects through applied design research. Our vision, our end, the goal we hope to aspire to, is to reduce the distance between the design innovation that the school is known for and the work of our students in the world. We know, of course, that our students have enormous impact in the world. We can measure that, we can talk about it. And at the same moment, we understand that there's often a delay or a lag between that impact in the world. We know that the challenges of the city rarely correspond to discrete professional boundaries, so calling oneself an architect or an engineer or an urban designer or even a landscape architect or a gardener or a painter, all of these things are interesting, but maybe none of them are really sufficient. And so we come ultimately under this rubric of design research. The activity of design is something that transcends architecture alone, in which engineering, architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, urban planning might comfortably sit. And in this regard, in his 1969 book, The Sciences of the Artificial, Herbert Simon succinctly described that work as what binds all of the professions together. Simon argued that design is the core of all professional training, that is, imagining the world different than it is now as it ought to be, and it is the principal mark that distinguishes the professions from the sciences. And so we know that design research, the work that we do through design, has a couple of characteristics that might be relevant. It's synthetic. It incorporates information from a variety of sources. It's characterized by its capacity to organize a complex array of information. We know that it often deploys simulations, and it can be scenario-based. We know that it's propositional, not just empirical. It's not just describing the world as found. And then finally, the idea that our projects, they stand in 2 forms. Simultaneously, they stand as propositions for changing the world, for intervening in the world, but they also stand as a unique body of knowledge about that world. And that dual valence is something that we're focused on, in particular in the office, because we think it's both unique as a characteristic to us, but it's also something that characterizes the work of design professionals more broadly. We have a range of subjects that we deal with. Among them, we're interested in questions of new models for new towns and satellite cities. We're interested in the idea of a new heliotropic return to solar orientation. We're interested in territorial urbanization, mobility, sea level and climate change, and a range of other subjects that we could discuss in greater detail. On our tour here in Colombia, in Chile, in Brazil, we're not only holding public events like this and meeting with colleagues to gather knowledge, we're also meeting with potential partners in the universities, in industry, in governance and civil society. And through those partnerships, we're hoping to be able to continue and build upon these engagements over the course of the next several years. Landscape as urbanism, I wanted to say just a word about as well. Over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, it's become clear for many of us, and myself certainly among those people, the idea that our traditional models of the city, of thinking through the city in the way that I was educated as primarily a work of architecture, have reached certain limits. And those limits can be described in a variety of ways, but among those limits are the challenges of using architecture alone to intervene in very complex social and environmental challenges. It's in that context that landscape urbanism has reemerged really in the last 15 years or so. And the fundamental idea here has been that our basic opposition of the city as one thing, as opposed to the countryside or nature or something else outside of it, that conceptual binary is itself problematic, and that ultimately we might be able to, through this funny, very curious concept of landscape, we might be able to re-enter the urban, but to re-enter an urbanism that is both more socially just and more environmentally leavened. Right? We can talk more about what that means. And so in my most recent publication, Landscape as Urbanism, I'm calling it a general theory. What I've tried to do is to put in a monograph form in one book, really a general argument for thinking of the city through landscape. And the biggest challenge there is for myself as an architect and for many of you as architects is for us to imagine that architecture is not the only tool that we have available, and to reimagine or re-enter the question of the city and its performance through terms of landscape. Now, as we've just heard, of course, the particular history here in Colombia is one informed by geography and by geology and a range of other things. It's also been socially and culturally constructed. And in my education, in my experience over many years, I didn't come to think of Colombia or Chile or Brazil as venues for landscape thinking. But only recently have I found, I think that there are practices that, while they may not be doing landscape, they're doing something. And what I want to pose to you is really a choice. As we come through today, the end of today, as we come through these 2 weeks, the question for me and for my team is really this, is on the one hand, are these alternative practices that we're looking at, do we think that they represent something that ecological or landscape thinking might be helpful to frame? Is that useful as a framework? Or on the other hand, is landscape simply getting in the way? Is there some other term or some other conception that might be useful? Because I'm convinced with what I've learned and what I've seen in my travels in the last several years, that the conditions for doing urban work in the Americas and in Colombia and Chile and Brazil and other places in South America, that these conditions have been transformed through a whole series of social and political transformations over the course of many, many years. That's produced a whole new set of opportunities, and that there's now a generation of architects practicing in a range of venues, not just one or two, doing work that I think might have something to do with landscape. And so over the course of these 3 events, what we'll be doing is we'll be hearing from and gathering as many local talented architects as we can to describe these conditions for us. One of the first pieces of evidence that I had in this thinking came to me when I first learned of the work of Paisajes Emergentes from Medellin, and through that work, then of course, Luis Callejas. And of course, we had a nice tour this morning. We got to visit the Aquatic Center, and we've also seen a range of other projects around town. And it was the audacity for Luis and his partners to first use that term that got my attention. And it was initially interesting because I got to meet Luis and recruit him to join us at Harvard, and he's now well on to his international career as a designer and as an academic. Having said that, what was interesting was it was the first of what I've now seen to be a regular series of events. I'm no longer surprised in this part of the world where I see young architects working in a way that I might associate with landscape. In this regard, I think that their proposal for the Rio Olympics is also equally remarkable here. Now, much has been said and much has been done, of course, about the river. There's more to be said today about the river. It's an important project here, ultimately, but it certainly fits within this general canon of thinking through the river. Of course, it's not without its controversies and its challenges, but it clearly is a project that piques my interest. I want to learn more about, and I, again, want to understand, well, around which framework is this project being put forward? Equally, you know, the project for the airport renovation in Caracas is interesting to me. Airports tend to be an important venue in these discussions of landscape urbanism, and so Latitude's work in both of these venues, I think, is quite interesting in this sense. As we move to Santiago later this week, we'll of course encounter a very different cultural history, a very different climate, a very different geography, very different geology. And among the speakers that we have with us in Santiago is Alfredo Ramirez. You'll know Alfredo Ramirez is the Mexican architect who is based now in a firm called Ground Lab and works out of the AA Landscape Urbanism Unit. And I've been interested to follow Alfredo's work over the last several years. This is their project for Mexico City from 3 years ago called Latent Landscapes. And it's indicative of Alfredo's commitments and really the Ground Lab team out of London and the AA Landscape Urbanism Unit more recently in this regard. In this regard, we could also say much more about Mexico, and probably we need to actually make a tour about Mexico and a couple of other venues as well. On that list, of course, Alfredo Ramirez's collaboration with Territorios Arquitectural in 2013 in Mexico is equally interesting. And that's, again, just the tip of a particular iceberg. I think there's a lot more work to be found over the course of the next several years. There's a body of work that's been produced in collaboration with Alfredo Ramirez working in Santiago, the work of Danilo Martic and other collaborators that's interesting here. In this case, their park of the city, their sports center is interesting to me. Ultimately also, their civic paseo is an interesting project. And so again, I don't want to make any particular claims about any one of these projects individually, but I'm interested to step back and see them collectively and to see what they share. So all of these projects share that they're from the recent past, the last 10, 12 years, they share that they're being done by a generation of architects that are interested specifically in landscape as a framework. They claim it as such, not only in their firm identity, in their intellectual commitments, in their teaching, but equally in their built work, that they're incorporating botanical, ecological, and biological inputs from a range of sources. Thank you. Gracias. Gracias. Discúlpame, pero no habla español. But the service here is very nice. Thank you. And then finally, Brasilia. How could we do this without going to Brasilia? Of course, our best colleagues gave us the advice that you really need to go to Sao Paulo and Rio, and we've done that. But I personally am deeply, deeply interested in Brasilia. You know, the capital project, we just saw Sert's pilot plan for Medellin, right? The pilot plan itself as an historic construct, of course, gives us an interesting intellectual kind of milieu in which to look at a range of work. And again, I don't want to make great claims for that work, but I do think that there's a range of interesting projects for us to look at in the Brazilian context as well. So I mentioned earlier, Pedro and Caroline are with us, and their Practice Plus D and their collaborators have been doing, I think, really, really interesting work that we'll hear more about over the course of today and future days. The Digital Agora and the Path to the Sky project, which are really socially based kind of community initiatives in which, again, I don't know what to call it. Maybe it's landscape that's giving them a kind of framework in which to think about the shape of the city. And then ultimately work in Sao Paulo and in Bahia by Una, you say Una, UNE, I think is equally indicative of these kinds of tendencies that we can find across Latin America, across South America, in which, on the one hand, you know, cleaning the brownfield industrial sites of industry, like the site of the museum that we're in just now, but equally dealing with the geographic, the geological, the territorial contexts in which urbanism might be resituated. And so thank you all again for being here. I just wanted to say in closing that in addition to the individual venue-specific, city-specific projects and prehistories, we are gathering precedents. We're looking for you to please send us the projects and the practices that you think might fit into this frame. We've just already seen the Orchid House presented very beautifully. Of course, it sits very squarely, and it's one of the major pieces of evidence, that and the Aquatic Center and the river, that led us to believe that Medellin would be the most interesting venue for this kind of a conversation, because again, I don't know if landscape is the only frame or the best frame for this kind of work, but it's certainly urban. It certainly incorporates a range of issues from the botanical through the biological, and it ultimately also arrives at design. And so in this regard, it's not simply a matter of territorial planning, but ultimately a work of urbanism in which design is rendered and made palpable. Equally in that regard, we, of course, would look forward to Luis's work going forward. We would also be mindful of the work of Kappa that we need to learn more about for a range of sites and subjects. And I wanted to just close with this image here. This is the work of my friend Ciro Nale from Buenos Aires. This is a project that's 22 years old. And of course, you'll recall Ciro from his role as the founding director of the Architectural Association's Landscape Urbanism Unit, and in that regard has had a long-standing commitment to these questions of landscape relative to urbanism. But what was interesting for me to discover in my conversations with him and in my work looking into the history of this material, that 25 years ago in a district in Buenos Aires, even prior to the discourse around landscape urbanism, there was a landscape interest, a landscape commitment in projects such as these that Ciro and his colleagues were engaged in. In that regard, the last thing that I would say before proceeding with the program is, again, just to welcome your input and your advice. We're here to learn and to understand the challenges that you're facing in your work, the kinds of issues that are important to you. And we're also organizing a course at the Graduate School of Design that Luis Calles has led. This is a course which is gathering precedents. We're gathering projects, we're gathering practices. We're looking for those practices in the Americas broadly that might be seen to provide us a kind of alternative history to urbanism in the Americas, and one in which landscape has been considered as a medium of urbanism. Thank you.